You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
This episode of Mission Log is brought to you by listeners like you, supporters on Patreon. Join today at patreon.com/missionlog.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, episode 422, Prodigal Daughter.
Welcome into another episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm John Champion.
And I'm Norman Lau. Each week on Mission Log, we examine an episode of Star Trek, one by one, picking it apart for morals, meanings, and messages, and seeing if we can really go home again.
This week, Ezri Dax goes home again, for better or for worse. We might side toward worse. I don't know. Let's see how it plays out.
And we'll meet the Tegans, minus Chrissy, in a moment. But first, a word on how you can reach us. Mission Log is a conversation about Star Trek, and that's why we want to hear from you. Use Mission Log Pod to give us a like and a share on Facebook and Twitter. Then follow and rate us at Apple Podcasts to help others find the show. You can call us on Skype at Mission Log Pod or by dialing 323-522-5641. Send us an email at missionlog@roddenberry.com, and remember, we may use your comments on an upcoming episode of Mission Log. And once again, the dapperest man in the history of trivia, here is John Champion.
Well, thank you for that. Trivia for today's episode, Prodigal Daughter. It was written by Bradley Thompson and David Weddle, our returning team, Ira Stephen Bear's friends. They had contributed Treachery, Faith, and The Great River earlier in the season, and the production found itself with a very short deadline for their next episode. They had originally pitched a show about Cisco meeting his future self, but Ira steered them toward a story that would explore Ezri Dax's backstory. One idea was that her mother was indeed part of the Orion Syndicate and had even pulled strings to have Ezri joined with the Dax symbiont. It was too much and too dark. The Syndicate stayed, but now it was oriented back toward O'Brien's encounter with Bilby in Honor Among Thieves. The episode was directed by Victor Lobel. Here we are at the end of Victor's 4-episode run on DS9. He directed In the Pale Moonlight, most recently in our discussion, and we will catch him twice on Voyager. Now, the title of the episode comes from the parable of the prodigal son, or the lost son, depending on which version of Luke you read from the Bible. It's not a direct corollary to this story, though. The son decided to take his half of his father's inheritance early and then ran off and spent it and went through famine, and then he returns home ashamed, only to be celebrated by his father. That makes his brother jealous, but their father is just glad that he who was lost is now found, so break out the fatted calf and celebrate. Some of the paintings that Norvo Tegan has been working on were actually created by Russ English, who was a set security officer who worked at Paramount. Don't worry, though, his originals were not destroyed. The art department had copies made. Let's talk about our guest stars. Meet the Tegan family. Ezri's brothers, Janelle and Norvo, are played by Mikhail Salazar and Kevin Rom, respectively. Mikhail has just a short acting resume, preceded here by a couple of appearances on Murphy Brown. He later moved over into the fitness industry and owns his own business. Kevin, on the other hand, got his guest roles relatively early in his career and then kept at it, just landing a number of recurring roles. He's been on Desperate Housewives and Bates Motel, and he had a very prominent recurring role as Ted Chow on Mad Men. Ezri's mother, Giannis, is played by Lee Taylor Young, who has had a long career, going back to her on-screen debut as a recurring character on Peyton Place in the late 60s. A bit of science fiction followed, as she was cast in the 1971 dystopian classic Soylent Green. Recurring and guest roles followed, from soap operas to A Voyage on the Love Boat. This is her only Star Trek appearance, but her sister, Dae Young, appeared on both TNG and in the DS9 episode, A Simple Investigation. Finally, I wanted to point out Thadiel Bokar, played by John Paragon. John was a creative force that has gone somewhat under the radar for a lot of viewers, but even if you don't know his name, you know his work. He was a member of Groundlings Theater, like so many comedy innovators of the 1970s, like Paul Rubens and Phil Hartman. He helped develop the character Elvira with Cassandra Peterson. He had a stand-up comedy career of his own, and he was Jambi on Pee-wee's Playhouse. He was also someone others went to for development of scripts and comedy entertainment. In later years, he even worked with Disney Imagineering for some of their show concepts to incorporate improv. We lost John in April of 2021.
I'm sure that in the long tradition of harmonious Star Trek reunions, Ezri is going to have a great time visiting with her totally normal, well-adjusted family this week.
Prologue. Sitting around a Quark's bar, Kira, Odo, and Ezri Dax are discussing the unfortunate order of Gach that Jadzia had placed to celebrate Martok's birthday. Ezri hates the stuff and wants nothing to do with it. Quiet and distracted this whole time is Dr. Bashir, who's thinking about his pal, Chief O'Brien, who's due to return to the station today after some time away. But the chief doesn't arrive, and that forces Bashir to drop a bomb on Captain Sisko. O'Brien wasn't away on a family visit, to see his father, to be clear. He actually went away to New Sydney in the Sephora system, trying to find what happened to Marika Bilby, the widow of the down-on-his-luck criminal Miles had befriended when working undercover for Starfleet intelligence. She's missing, and Miles has always felt a bit concerned about her since, he was part of the reason her husband got whacked through a setup by the Orion Syndicate. Sisko is not happy about the news, but he wants a report from Bashir on the whole mess, and he turns to Ezri Dax. It just so happens that her mother and two brothers live in the Sephora system, operators of a mining business, and far away from Federation jurisdiction. Ezri has a, shall we say, distant relationship with her family. Hasn't even spoken to her mother in 6 months, but she's willing to ask for help finding the chief, and her mother is happy to oblige, as long as Ezri comes home for a visit. Act 1. With no small amount of trepidation, Ezri heads off to Sephora 7. Home is a huge, glass-walled, modern home overlooking an entirely industrial view of the mining operation. Ezri is greeted by one of her brothers, the frustrated artist Norvo, who immediately denigrates the work he has hanging up all over the house. Then there's Janelle, a little tougher and more businesslike. He's just come from the mine. Finally, there's Mother, Janas. Icy, tough, but glad to see her daughter. There's a bit of business to take care of, always. Janas tells Norvo she needs the financial reports he's supposed to have finished. She then tells Janelle that they need to fire someone called Lorcan, who is incompetent and costing the company a fortune. With that, she leaves the room with Ezri, which leaves the two sons to talk more candidly. They'll fire Lorcan, but this is more likely deliberate sabotage than incompetence. Janelle will have to deal with a guy called Bokar, who's part of the Orion Syndicate. Act 2. Dinner with Ezri's family, the Tegan family, is fine. Ezri is still getting used to being around them, and they're getting used to the idea that she's joined with the Dax symbiont since the last time they saw her. It's a lot of getting used to. After dinner, Ezri goes into Norvo, the artist's room. It's a hodgepodge of sculptures and paintings and all sorts of stuff, the worst of which he says is his. He's down on himself, getting rejected from the Andorian Academy of Art, and all he wants to do is wallow in his misery, maybe hit the Saurian brandy hard to forget his troubles. He thinks he's not good enough, lacks discipline, and he's needed here in the family business. But Ezri reminds him that's just what their mother thinks. He's entitled to a life of his own. The next morning, Norvo's got a hangover. and Janos is blaming Dax. He also defaced his own work, and Janos thinks it's Ezri's disruptive presence. But Ezri counters with a little better understanding. Norvo is being smothered by her, and he needs his freedom. Just then, Janelle interrupts their clash with a visit from one of the local authorities and Miles O'Brien. The chief is in cuffs and beat up a bit by the Orion Syndicate, but he found Marika. She's dead. Act 3. O'Brien found Marika's body, probably 6 weeks dead, with head trauma and floating in the river. Before he could do anything about it, though, some Nausicaans decided to beat him up to scare him off the Syndicate, and that's when the authorities intervened, and they don't seem interested in pursuing the case any further. Rested and well-fed, O'Brien is recruited to apply his engineering skills to a piece of mining equipment that's been giving the family some trouble, and he's glad to give it a look. But back to Norvo for a minute. Still hungover, still destroying his art, and still despondent enough to talk to Ezri about taking his own life, a joke that doesn't go over well with the counselor. She offers him a break. What if he came back to DS9 with her just to clear his head, to get away from all this for a while? He's not convinced they could get along without him, but he'll think about it. Down in the mine, the chief is doing what the chief does, teching the tech like nobody else can. He found a part that is failing on one of their drills because it's the wrong part, mislabeled to look like the right part, either accidentally or on purpose. O'Brien and Janelle are interrupted by the Farian, a commodities broker, Dario Bokar, who dismisses the chief so he can talk to Janelle alone. This engineer works for Starfleet Intelligence, and he's trying to find someone. Does Janelle know who? It's Marika Bilby, and rumor has it that she's dead. A surprised Janelle listens intently as Bokar tells him that O'Brien needs to leave because it would be a shame if something happened to him. Act 4. Dutifully, Janelle tells O'Brien that he really needs to go, but O'Brien just says he's taking orders from his superior officer, Ezri, plus he's in no hurry to get back to Cisco. When Janelle hurriedly walks out of the room and Ezri enters, O'Brien tells her his suspicion. Bokar acts like a guy working for the Syndicate, and Janelle acts like a guy who is being pressured by the Syndicate. Maybe they should sneakily take a peek at the family business financial records. They do, and what they find is that the payroll shows a connection between the Orion Syndicate and the mining operation when a certain Marika Bilby was on the company payroll. Act 5. Ezri has no idea what's going on, so she and O'Brien dig deeper. Starting about 9 months ago, Marika was hired to do some undefined job. Then the salary started increasing by quite a lot until they stopped the day before she was killed. According to Ezri, everyone in her family has access to the books and responsibility for their contents, but she has no idea who would directly know about Marika, or maybe it's all of them. Time to confront the family. Janos wants to know the truth from Janelle, who explains that they hit a rough patch with the business and the Orion Syndicate showed up to bail them out. He accepted their offer and nobody around him seemed to pay it any attention. But then the Syndicate needed a favor out of them, to put someone on payroll without any actual work, to repay a debt. Marika wasn't happy with the amount, though, and she kept asking for more. She was angry at her dead husband, at the Syndicate, at the people paying her, but Janelle insists he didn't kill her, which leaves the question of who did. The more the finger is pointed at Janelle, and the more he denies it, the tormented artist, Norvo, perks up and asserts himself. He didn't mean to do it. He went to Marika to see if he could reason with her, but she wouldn't accept it. Here he is, the son who was seen as lacking strength of his own, now really acting out on his own. He took care of the tough problem on his own. Ezri's eyes fill with tears. Sometime later, Norvo is arrested and taken away. Janelle, in shock, starts talking about mining work, but Ezri tells him it doesn't matter. He needs to go somewhere else and start a new life. That just leaves Janos. Ezri announces that she'll stay long enough for Norvo's trial, and Giannis doesn't respond except to ask if what happened was her fault. Ezri doesn't answer, but just walks away. Time has passed, and the trial is over. Ezri Dax is back home on DS9, where she's found by Chief O'Brien. She tells him that Norvo was sentenced to 30 years, and while the chief says it's a light punishment considering, Ezri can't help but be sympathetic. She knew him as he was, and now seeing what's happened, she can't help but blame herself for all the times that she wasn't at home. The end.
Thank you for that wonderful review, John. I guess my big question is, what about the cat?
Okay, I say what about the cat. You say what about the cat. One person who does not say what about the cat, Keiko. But Keiko's nowhere to be found.
Technically, she says, so what about the cat?
Yeah.
Right,
She does not care about the cat. Keiko, good grief, chill. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess next time we see her on the show, maybe she'll, be okay with the cat. I guess we'll find out. Mm-hmm. One thing that we learned on today's episode, you can't shoot 51 containers of gach out an airlock due to environmental regulations. Good to know. That is important to know. I'm glad to know that, as vast as space is, there are still environmental regulations. Makes sense. Could you just maybe shoot it toward a sun? Like, could you maybe put it in a torpedo or multiple torpedoes, maybe to tow it to the nearest, flaming ball of hot gas in the sky and just let that go to town?
I'm surprised that, say, someone like an entrepreneur like Quark didn't get wind of this and say, hey, you know what, Ezri, if you don't want those, there's a Klingon chef on station who I could get, cents on the Latinum for.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And sell those things at cost.
He could totally take it off her hands. That was a business opportunity that they missed out on. By the way, also, I'm just impressed that there are 51 varieties of gach, like the one that stood out to me. Well, one has feet, one squirms, but one is packed in targ blood. Very interesting detail there on gach. I smell a future trivia question based on that.
I'll tell you what, though. Nicole's really good at playing it nauseous. Because ever since that we've been introduced to her character, she just really knows how to make her stomach churn expressions and sell that. Yeah. Right? I didn't know there was such a thing as a Gach Fest. Maybe, is that our new musical event? The Gach Fest?
Gach Fest? Mission Log presents Gach Fest?
Yeah.
Maybe so, yeah. But I do like that detail. I mean, there are a lot of good character details with Ezri Dax, and I do like that one that in all the years of Star Trek up until this point, we had not seen somebody who just has something very normal, like getting space sick or, just getting turned off at certain foods. Anything like that really grounds a character, makes him relatable. I like that. We always point out, the return of a classic line, and we've been getting a few of these in a row. He's not a detective, he's an engineer. Kind of a
that was great.
Spin on a classic Trekism right there.
Yeah, that was fun. Speaking of engineers, so you have the chief engineer on the station that is a dedicated base to the front line of this war, and he can just go off book on a mission because...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, how does that happen? Like, who signs his time off sheet? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. Well, apparently Cisco, which just seems like a bad idea all around, and the chief lied about it and said, I'm going home to visit my father. But even then, it's like, could you do something maybe closer where you could get back here because we're in a war?
Okay, so Alan, this is for you. So here's your meme. Like, more believable, Cisco forgetting that he signed off time off sheet, or Miles visiting someone other than his actual family? Go. Right?
Yes. I love it. Yeah.
Now, speaking of family, the family estate that's on this mining planet, the Tegan estate, did anyone think that it was a good idea to put a giant diamond spike in the middle of a hydraulic door? Does that make sense?
They made some very weird design choices there. It's an impressive building. It's big. It says, I read somewhere that they were kind of loosely inspired by like a Frank Lloyd Wright thing with the cantilevered front of it and all. But yeah, there's some also weird design choices. By the way, the set, part of it is a redress of Vic's Lounge.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And speaking of that set, I really like Norvo's room because it's just cluttered and full of art, and it just looks like the only place that has any life in that house. You know? I mean, everything's nice, but that looks like the room you can actually relax in.
He has one of those doors, too. I guess that's like the door style, right, in that particular compound.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I'm glad that like nobody wears watches in this, in this era, because you walk into one of those diamonds, you're going to like trash your watch.
Oh, hey, look, I mean, not even the watch. I just, I'm the type of person who walks into a room and I actually, real story, true story, I got my belt loop caught on the door hardware of my home office, and it literally ripped it out of the door jamb. Oh. The little, So I'm a menace no matter what. If you put that much stuff in front of me, watch out. It's all going down.
Okay, so here's something that surprised me and made me laugh to no end. Andorian Art Academy?
I know, right?
I think it's brilliant, and yet makes me question so many things.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, like, what's next on the surprise list of things that we don't know about? Like, the Tellarite Culinary Institute?
Yeah.
Right? Because, you never know.
Could be. Yeah, they just dropped those in there. Yeah, Andorians, not a thing up to this point that we would know them for their art. One thing that I'm kind of disappointed in, it is the 24th century, still no cure for a hangover. I thought that would be the kind of thing you would have, particularly in a big, nice, expensive, well-appointed house like that. That's just a thing that you should have in the medicine cabinet.
I tell you, man, that Saurian brandy is dangerous. It's dangerous stuff.
Rough, yeah.
So, John, if you watch this scene over and over again, as I did, the police officer that brought in Miles in handcuffs, exactly what part of New York City or one of the 5 boroughs was this new Sydney cop from? Because, like, you know what I'm saying? Like hey, you got Miles O'Brien here. You got somebody here who did a crime. I'm going to have to arrest them. And now you're doing Tegan family.
That's kind of awesome. Like, of all the things in Star Trek that are reflective or representative of Earth cultures, Vulcans sort of vaguely influenced by, Eastern mysticism and Stoicism and all this stuff. Here you've got something very specific, inspired by Brooklyn.
Easily.
Yeah.
I thought I was listening to Bill the Butcher or something like that.
Yes. But hey, and you mentioned the the shout out to the Andorians. Here we have also a shout out to Rigel 4, which we've never seen, but it's been mentioned ever since TOS, way back in Wolf in the Fold. So a planet with a long history in Star Trek.
Well, here's something that you don't mess with ever. Right? And my money is always going to be on the chief when it comes to on-site identification of a transdator chip. Right?
Man, oh man. Yeah.
Right? He goes, it's clearly marked this way. Well, Miles is like, well, I don't care how it's clearly marked. I can tell by this that it ain't that. Right? He's like the James Bond of engineer chips.
He is, right? Unless it's one of those things where it just happens to be so common for him. And, for somebody else, it's not. It's like if somebody, brought you, say, like an iPhone 6, but they had written 12 on it. Somebody else, they're like, well, clearly it says 12. Like, no. Let me just explain. It's not.
Yeah. This is at like the Genius Bar, right? I bought this iPhone 6. It's not a 6. I bought this iPhone 12. It's not a 12.
Not a 12.
So, interesting thing about technology. When it works, it works. And what I love about this episode is that, you know what? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So why change what a hard hat looks like in a mining operation?
Yeah. Right? Great point. Yes.
I mean, it does what it does. And you don't really have to, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. But it just seems like with the transdator chips and all this technology and kind of like these laser drills and stuff.
Yeah.
The hard hat just seems so antiquated.
They got to a certain point on DS9 where a set decorator was being told by the producers, like, look, we spend all our money on space glasses for Quark's bar, And space forks for all the tables. I'm sorry, you can't have space hard hats. You just kind of have to go with conventional hard hats. Yeah.
Sometimes the world building just gets put aside,
Yeah.
just a little too often, and for my taste, in this series. So we, as we've learned, kind of like Ezri's personality, she's kind of very wallflower sometimes, very sheepish sometimes. But when she kind of like put up her back and said to Chief, when he was trying to investigate like who this money like went to, when she said like don't investigate this, that's an order. I'm like, ooh, there it is.
Yeah, because
like,
that time it was personal, that time it was family.
Exactly.
And yeah, that was interesting to see. We should be able to reassert that later on.
And John, you never go against the family. Speaking of not going against the family, there is a moment in time when a character truly reveals his or herself. That smile at the end from Norvo, wow, that was like, oh my God, that was chilling.
Definitely his strongest moment. I'm going to have something to say about the actors later on in the show, but that was a great shot, almost like a little Anthony Perkins in that moment. Yeah.
Hey boss, can I go on a vacation with the mob in the middle of the war? Thanks, you're the best. P.S. Look after my cat.
We will get right back to Prodigal Daughter after a word from our sponsor this week. And, well, that sponsor is all of you. It's all of you who have joined us over at Mission Log's Patreon. And that is patreon.com/missionlog, where there is so much going on every day of the week. Norman, what's happening at Patreon?
So what's happening over on Patreon, John, is that not only do we have fantastic Patreon subscribers, but some of those subscribers, a majority of them, have actually come over to what we offer on Patreon as a service, and that is our Discord server. And our Discord server is just this fantastic community of all of our subscribers, or most of our subscribers, that have come over and have engaged in so many different channels that we've created, from food and beverages to every single permutation of Star Trek that's out there, past and present, and a variety of different topics in between. The great thing about this is people can engage in a forum that they feel safe and secure and confident about being able to share who they are, their ideas, in a respectful and an encouraging environment.
Yeah, it's not the same old social media. This truly is a community. We're all having a blast there. We get to have deep and thoughtful conversations as well as a lot of fun. And sometimes we have those conversations live over video, as we do with our weekly After Dark feedback sessions after an episode of Mission Log drops. You've been doing Sunday morning chats just to get everybody engaged and to check in. Another opportunity during the week. And like you said, there are all the discussion boards that are just happening all the time. I want to give a shout out to our newest members who have joined us over at Patreon: Armin, Janet, the Lone Draftsman, Joanna, and Scott Palm. Good to see you, my friend, over there. So everybody jump into the Discord, say hi to each other, and just jump into that conversation. We will see you there soon at patreon.com/missionlog. All right, Norman, a longtime meme in Mission Log is that everybody on Star Trek is an orphan by fate or by choice. And now we have Ezri Dax to add to the mix. And I really have to wonder, I mentioned back in trivia that this is an episode that was on a very short deadline. They'd kind of run out of ideas here in the middle of the season. Some stuff was being put off on purpose, but here they had about a 2-week window before filming was going to start. So they just had to knock out a script fast. We're going to do something that's the backstory of Ezri, who then said, well, her family's got to be a wreck. Because that seems to be such an ongoing thing. In terms of positive role models, let's see, in this series, we've got, we got Sisko. Maybe put Martok in there, certainly being a father, brother/father figure to Worf. Then we have people like Dr. Bashir, who by choice distance themselves from their families out of embarrassment or annoyance or self-preservation. I just wonder, is it because in a lot of literature and a lot of kind of heightened storytelling, our heroes have to have some separation from family? Or is it because DS9 in particular, maybe Star Trek in general, doesn't always do a great job with families when they get them? I mentioned two of the good ones, but, let's not put too fine a point on it. The O'Brien family situation has just been bungled from beginning to end. And I didn't mention it too much in the recap or in the observations, but we certainly hint at it. Here's Chief O'Brien with some time off, and he just goes and does something completely unrelated to the fact that he's got a wife and kids.
Yeah, the interesting thing about family dynamics in Star Trek, I think that we're used to we're used to learning our characters because our characters become these icons that mean so much to us. Not every single character, but we always have those characters that we gravitate to. And I think that much like in life, like say at work, there are people that we gravitate to at work, or there are people that we gravitate to in our social situations. And then we see, maybe we have the opportunity to see them in their family dynamic. We'll get invited to, say, and this is apropos to what's happening right now, we're coming up on holiday season. So we may be introduced to someone else's family during the holidays. We may be introduced to them for some type of milestone event, like a birthday, or a wedding, or a bar mitzvah, or a confirmation, something where you take that particular character or that particular person that you've either idolized or learned to grow and love or learn to just really respect, and you see them in their natural surrounding. That changes everything.
Yeah.
It really does, because the person that you think isn't the person who they are in those particular circumstances. Maybe it's because they want to create this distance of, this isn't what makes me who I am. This is part of my life, but it doesn't define me, right? My career or my identity is something that only you have the perspective of. We being the audience, only have the perspective of. So all of these people that we've learned to idolize in the series or subsequent series, these are our heroes. And what's that old adage? Be very careful about meeting your heroes, right?
Yeah. Well, let's see, but I wonder, though, is there something, an unintended message here that undermines, as much as Star Trek has this positive view of humanity and the positive view of our abilities, is there something a little darker at play here? And it might just be because it's a literary or entertainment trope when it comes to heroes and their journeys that says that families aren't a part of that. There's a lot to be said about the friends who are chosen families, and clearly people who get together on a crew. Generally, they work well together. They are respectful of each other. They have personal lives with each other as well. But typically, when you introduce a family member, it's to the detriment of that character. I like what you're saying about the idea of giving a character some color and giving a character some deeper aspects that we don't always see, because what we see is their job. But, it's one thing for Worf to have this sort of comedically entertaining family, the Rozhenkos, who just seem like lovely, if a bit over-the-top people. But then he is embarrassed by them and shuns them and acts horribly toward them, So it would be one thing if we just got a little taste of it, say oh, okay, well, they come from a quirky family life, and isn't that charming? But it's another thing when you dig another layer deeper and go oh, they're actually dysfunctional and terrible to each other as well. And that's what we have here with Ezri.
Well, sometimes when people get to see, get to look behind the veil and see exactly like the Wizard of Oz, pulling all the strings, and that he's just a human man, that's something that is it's something that people don't want to have exposed, as part of their lives. They've cultivated their lives and curated kind of like their social presence, their online presence, or their professional presence in such a way where they're trying to kind of be the ideological version of themselves, like the best version of themselves. That's just because people haven't been able to dig deep in their background. It's akin to finding someone's yearbook and saying, "I can't believe you had that hair," or you're most voted to succeed in this or that,
Sure.
or you are part of such and such club. This is your past. No one really likes their past being looked into without specific permissions or guidance. Looking through that past, because there are a lot of inferences, there are a lot of assumptions that can be made. Oh, you're like this now because of this part of your past. Oh, Ezri's like this now because we've met her mom. Now, fortunately for her, only the chief has met the family, and he's probably going to be sworn to silence because of the ongoing investigation, litigation that's happening with Norvo.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's mortifying, right? When you have somebody whose opinion you respect meet your family who they're not all on the same page as you are, just in terms of your outward professional curated personal appearance.
Well, let me go back to something you just said, though, which is this idea that you can sort of get to know somebody, you learn something about their family, their upbringing, their background, and you go like, oh, okay, you are this person because of that background. Which is true. We are all a product of our environments. We're all a product of our upbringing. But in this episode, that comes to a very strange place. Ezri is who she is because of her background and her experiences. Norvo is who he is because of his background and experiences. And that's where we get to this really interesting, touchy place of that fine line between blame and responsibility. And I don't think this episode necessarily comes down on a specific, but we'll get to that in our wrap-up in a few minutes here. But I get left with this kind of ambiguity in that final moment between Ezri and her mother. So remember, Giannis asks, this isn't my fault, is it, Ezri? I didn't do this, did I? And what does Ezri do? She just turns and walks away. Now, I'm not saying that there is a perfect answer to that, but by turning and walking away, I think that just leaves far more questions than it actually attempts to answer there. I would say to Giannis, if you were to actually try to take this maybe a little dispassionately, a little clinically, so Giannis, no, you didn't do this. You are not to blame in this respect. And she may be a terrible mother, although that can only be measured in degrees, because certainly on Star Trek we've seen some good mothers and some terrible mothers. But Norvo's actions are his own. And this is a place that I think is really...
But are they, though?
Well, okay, so just the same way that we have to look at all of the characters in that family. Like, if we're going to say that they are all a product and therefore the person who was the authority figure, the parent in this case, is responsible for all of their actions, well, Giannis is responsible for all the good things that Ezri has done. She's responsible for all the bad decisions that Janelle has done. She's responsible for the bad behaviors that Norvo has taken. But if you take that to logical extreme, well, Giannis is simply a product of her upbringing by her parents, who are simply a product of the upbringing by their parents, and so on until you rewind it and get back to, I don't know, the Big Bang,
that's not necessarily wrong, because I think that sometimes, there are certain emotional rails that are set. And I think that at least if we just take the responsibility of talking about what happened with Norvo's path was set on a very specific course because of very specific examples of how he was overlooked. So let's take the dinner the scene, for example, the dinner scene. Mm-hmm. He was trying to do something. He was trying to actually pay compliment to his sister, who he hasn't seen in months, right? He's just glossed over every single time. And not just from, Giannis, from Janelle as well. He's glossed over every single time. His level of importance was reduced to nothing. So if that happens to somebody, that's a condition that they have been set to in order to operate mentally from. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily that he is necessarily responsible for his own actions. He's conditioned to behave in a certain way because of the, of the consistency of what happened to him.
that is all a contributing factor. I think ultimately the action, the choice taken to go into action comes down on that person, not the, when Norvo goes to trial, clearly it's not his mother on trial and her parents on trial and their parents on trial. Of course, we can look at contributing factors, but ultimately it's him at the end of the day. It was his choice to go over to that house. It was his choice to, or choice is not the right word there, but his reaction that he had. And yes, he is a product of that conditioning. He is a product of all of that. But if you were to try to go down that road to point blame, you could say, yeah, but look at Giannis's daughter. She's a successful Starfleet officer who's...
But not because of Giannis. She left. Ezri left.
Well, she left at a certain point, but
she left because she needed to. She needed to grow.
Yeah.
So obviously I have some very strong feelings about this, but the thing is that I think that all of the children in this family have been choiceless from the very beginning. They didn't have a choice to be who they wanted to be. So look at Janelle. Janelle, I don't think that he wanted to be some type of like foreman or mining operator. He resents almost every single thing from the tone of what he says. He doesn't like it, but he has to do it. Why? Because he's the eldest. I'm stealing my, my actual notes.
Yeah, that's good.
That's
good.
But I guess that what I'm saying is, and why I have a point of contention here is, yes, Norvo is to blame for the murder. Obviously, it was his choice to do that. Choice I used loosely, but it's the conditions of why he did it were not his choice at all. He was cornered into it, right? He was cornered into making this decision, a decision that he didn't have the agency or understanding to make. Because of how he was conditioned.
But you think he didn't understand that murdering somebody is wrong? I understand it's a crime of passion. He got worked up. We didn't see that scene take place, but they were arguing over money, and she was angry. That was his description of her. She was angry about this, angry about that, angry about the other thing, and he didn't. I don't think
he had the intellectual agency to understand how he could maneuver himself out of that situation. That's what happens when people are when the choice is taken away from people. They don't build up the intelligence level to be able to find every single possible way out. Janelle probably could have. Ezri definitely could have, and so would Giannis. But Norva he's just this overtly sensitive, artistic spirit. What does he know about subterfuge or intrigue or politics or obfuscation? Nothing. So the only thing that he could do is react in a way where it's survival of the fittest. And what do survival of the fittest responses indicate? You either kill or be killed. That's how you survive. He went to a very primal decision-making process, and that's the only thing that he knew. Why? Because he didn't have the opportunity to make those decisions for himself to get to that moment.
I have to say, I think Giannis can shoulder some of the blame for having this toxic environment that he's brought up in, for smothering him, for doing all the things that Ezri calls her out about. At the end of the day, though, it's the hand-holding disappears. And as terrible and maybe not outright abusive, but certainly emotionally abusive as she was to all of her kids, well, 1 out of 3 of those kids is a murderer. The other 2 are definitely not. So how much of that blame can we say actually belongs on Giannis as opposed to, well, it's this young guy who's screwed up, and we can point to all the reasons that he's screwed up, but it still comes down to him on that day and what he chose to do.
Then I guess that begs the bigger question. Then why does she have to ask that rhetorical question to Ezri, who doesn't have any answers for her? Because that's like the sticking point of what we're talking about here. If she didn't feel somewhat responsible or wholly responsible for her son's actions, then why ask the question to begin with?
Now that is a fascinating question, and that's how I wonder, how will it affect the character going forward? So I guess we'll find out in the many, many sequels to this episode. How does Giannis deal with this?
Let's bring this in for a landing with a thorough analysis of Ezri's totally normal, well-adjusted family, as soon as she finds one.
So as we do here in Mission Log, traditionally we get to the end of the episode, and as you can probably tell by the previous segment that there are a lot of things that John and I still have unresolved that we'd like to get to, and we're going to try and get to that in these two last segments. Does this episode hold up? Does it stand the test of time? And then finally in our morals and meanings and messages. So I'd like to start with you, John. Let's start with the very first and obvious topic. Does this episode hold up for you?
So I feel like this is one of those where even the writers admit, like, oh, we didn't have much time. That's sort of an excuse up front, even before you've gotten into the episode. I feel like this isn't a bad episode, a patently bad episode. It's just sort of, it leaves me with the question of, why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why do you live here? And I'm going to draw a really weird parallel. The movie Solo. You saw Solo, right? Everybody saw Solo because
I love Solo.
Okay, all right. So, because everybody loves Han Solo, right? And Disney decided to make a prequel movie about him. And it was well produced and it had a big budget and some good action sequences. But a friend of mine asked me after I saw that if giving Han Solo a tragic love story in his background made me like the character anymore. And I had to admit that I didn't care at all. Like the fact that he had that backstory now didn't affect my appreciation or fandom of that character that has been there for 40 years, And there wasn't going to be anything in the movie that informed or deepened what we already liked. So here's the problem with Ezri. It's the same thing. We already like her. And DS9 already has done a brilliant job by changing who Dax is now and introducing a character who truly stands on her own. And she already got a great single episode focus with Afterimage. And similarly, I'll go down on a path here with Chief O'Brien. We all love the Chief. And I liked the episode Honor Among Thieves a bit more than you did, Norman. But still, I don't know if I needed any follow-up there. I mean, the guy has Bilby's cat, which everyone seems to either forget about or hate if you're Keiko. So I don't know if I needed more detail on either of those characters' lives. And look, this is no slight on Nicole DeBoer at all. She is great as always. And I just feel like in this, there's no chemistry with Ezri and her brothers. And I get it that they're in a chilly family dynamic, but come on. The problem is this episode is trying to be a family drama like Long Day's Journey into Night, where you have all this sort of, intimate scenes of dialogue, and then it reveals and builds up to something. But you're trying to do that and do a crime drama, like a procedural, And at the end, I found Ezri's family to be pretty forgettable, except in the abstract. I'll walk away from DS9 going, well, Ezri's a great character, and they made bold choices by making her different from Jadzia. And, oh yeah, her family's a mess. But that's basically what I'll take out of it. So it doesn't hold up as an episode, anything beyond just the fact that Nikki is good, and Cullum is good as always, and that's about it. I didn't need these stories to enhance my enjoyment of what I already enjoyed. So I have to say no on this one. How about you?
See, this is where I love having these conversations with you, John, because it's not necessarily that I disagree with you. It's just that I see this episode from a completely different perspective.
That's why I'm here. I mean, I'm here for this.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that, yes, where does this episode lie in kind of like the last 14 or so episodes that we have to the end of the series?
Yeah.
Like, is this episode an episode worth telling? I would say yes and no. I would say no because, we're dealing with a very limited amount of time to tell and wrap up this very significant story in the history of Star Trek. But I would also say yes because I think this episode is relevant and transcends more than just a story within the Star Trek universe. So I'm looking at it from what does this mean in terms of more of a meta universe type of a story. So what happened to Norvo is prevalent and applicable to many sensitive young men and women who feel and always have felt choiceless and trapped for a variety of different reasons. Norvo represents those who have tragically fallen through the cracks of his own family. And because he was gifted with abilities such as sensitivity and creativity and a unique way of seeing the world as expressed through artwork and poetry and endeavors that give him a way to channel these very powerful and personal forms of expression, this is the way the story is structured, and specifically the way the archetypes of Ezri's family is presented in both relatable and identifiable ways. The overbearing mother who uses her maternal strength differently in order to protect what is hers, including, going back to what I just described about Norvo, suffocating nature of using her children in order to further the family's business and status, not only in Trill society, but in the capitalist circles that she's involved with. Janelle, being the eldest, had the succession plan from parent to child thrust upon him, so the overwhelming need to succeed forced him into making decisions, any decisions, in order to prove to the family that he had the will and the means to lead when called upon. Now, Ezri, by her own admission, chose to leave because she saw how her mother and the business was turning her family into something she found distasteful and stagnant. Mm-hmm. And Norvo, being the creative and sensitive one, was simply lost in the balance without even that which fed his very soul. His creativity, his artistry stripped away from him at an inch at a time, only to make his stand with the most extreme choice to murder Marika Bilby just to prove his worth to his family. So this family dynamic is something that many of us have either experienced firsthand or have been witness of and have been helpless to affect, which is why I feel this episode is so incredibly powerful and does withstand the test of time, because it's a story that happens every single day, and it has the potential to destroy so many innocent lives, because in our society, feelings and sensitivity and creativeness and individuality and daydreaming and artistic expressions are values that are tragically put aside because commerce and personal financial gain and the accumulation of wealth are still the social currencies that sadly still retain their influence and value.
I love everything that you just said, particularly about the value that we put on those kind of more abstract and esoteric ideals that we pay a lot of lip service to, but then at the end of the day we put aside because, well, money is what talks. I wish that I got that out of this episode. I really wish I did. And my worry is that it sort of devolves into this trope where it's, okay, here's the messed up family. Let's point the finger at, oh, well, it all goes back to the evil mother. So, it takes all of that and just sort of boils it down to this one archetype character. And I wish that, maybe it's part of the problem with Ezri being a new character on the show, is that you don't have the time to actually parcel out these things. Maybe if I'd felt a connection to Norvo earlier, and thought like, oh, wow, he's got this sensitive artistic spirit, I'm interested in him, then maybe I would feel like I was more emotionally involved in it. But that then brings us to our morals, meanings, messages, and what we got out of it. And, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to be flippant or jokey ever in this section. Sometimes it feels like there just isn't a lot there. And I don't know that there's, with the original writer's intent, that there was a lot of a message here, because it is kind of like an episode of Columbo with some character nuggets thrown in there for Miles and in particular for Ezri. Certainly don't do business with the mob. That should be, good lesson for anybody. I wondered if some of these morals, meanings, messages, some of these more pointed lines of dialogue were really the right lines of dialogue. So Ezri says to Janelle, after Norvo's trial is over, you need to go. It doesn't matter, just go. Find another life for yourself. Trust me, you'll be happier. Given this family, maybe that's right, but Is it really? Is it totally? Is that the best course of action? And does she mean without any of the rest of the family, just, you know what, Janelle, go. And don't even care or wonder or worry about what happens to our mother? There's sort of a big loose end there at the end of that statement. I understand where her heart's coming from in that, because she did get to go away. But
right.
She got to go away into a structure that was there ready for her, ready to absorb all these orphans who go off and become heroes in starships, and leave behind a family that was still intact. Dysfunctional, but intact. So is it just as easy to dole out that advice to a guy like Janelle? Janelle seemed... And look, maybe this was the actor, maybe this was the writing, maybe it was the directing, I don't know. Janelle seemed tougher, but just as lost as Norvo.
I agree. I totally agree. And going back to your point, just to jump in here for a second, I think that if we had more history with Ezri, this would have probably had a little bit more impact overall for a general audience, as opposed to, say, me specifically.
Yeah. And then there's that last scene that I think is so interesting with Ezri and the Chief. And this is after the trial and after we know that Norvo is getting 30 years. And Ezri says, I should have seen that. I should have tried to stop it. The Chief says, you're not responsible for that. And she says, but I am, don't you see? I should have gone home a long time ago. And this is where I think the episode is getting lost in its own message. Ezri absolutely does blame her mother for Norvo's actions, and then tries to blame herself? Wants to shoulder some of that blame for herself by saying that, because I didn't go home enough or at the right time or say the right thing when I was there. And it takes the Chief here to be the counselor and say, no, you're not. So the round robin of blame and guilt here is a bit of a mess. And I'm not saying that it's not realistic. People do that all the time. It's just an odd place to end this story where almost nobody pipes up and says, Norvo committed a crime. He might have had bad influences in his life, but that is another story. Right now, the thing we're concerned about is that he committed a crime, and he needs to pay for that. And I understand that there are people who shoulder that guilt rightly or wrongly. And now realistically, we're in the position where the counselor needs the counseling because it can just as easily eat her up as well. But she is looking to spread out this guilt and this level of responsibility on their mother and now on herself. It becomes a strange closed loop system here.
Well, the interesting thing about guilt is that, guilt, some people have this, this opinion of guilt being kind of like this all-encompassing thing, but it has a multitude of layers, how people kind of identify with that guilt. And I think that that's where Ezri is at right now at the end of the episode. It's what did she do or what didn't she do that would have possibly helped Norvo through this? And we saw this throughout the course of the episode. She's the only one that really kind of understood him, right? She's the only one who tried to at least understand him and tried to foster like this connection between who he was as an artist, who he was as this creative and gentle soul. I guess for me, like this episode, it all begins with a quote that kind of popped into my head when I first saw this episode, and that's from William Shakespeare's Hamlet from Act 1, Scene 3. The quote says, "To thine own self be true." Now, that cuts both ways, right? Because it describes what Norvo was going through throughout the course of this episode, and I think that this is where I landed with morals and meanings and messages. What does this phrase mean, and why is it applicable here? Why am I bringing this up? So at first, when we saw Ezri support Norvo about staying the course and pursuing his happiness and a career in art, this is how I felt that Shakespeare's quote was applicable. As someone who struggled trying to convince my own parents, especially my dad, about dropping pre-med to pursue a career in art, especially in comic book illustration, the reaction that I experienced was something that was emotionally challenging for me. And after a long period of depression and self-doubt about my own abilities and choices in my own life, I did eventually come to the conclusion that it was my own life that I was fighting for? What's more empowering than the gift that we can truly cherish in our lives than the ability to decide our own fates for ourselves? When we come to that realization, we choose to live and succeed or fail based on our own choices and our own merits and our own passions. That's the moment in our lives where we have true freedom, right? Have true agency over who we are, whether those choices are professional or religious or discovering our sexual or gender identities. Embracing the path that leads us to become our very best selves empowers us with something stronger and more enlightening and freeing than any force that we can imagine, except for perhaps one: parental approval. What Norvo ultimately suffered his entire life is the quote-unquote immovable object to his irresistible force, his mother's approval. And you can use that as a way to just say parental approval. And ultimately, this is when the perversion of Shakespeare's quote, "to thine own self be true," can be applied to what Norvo had become. His own self as seen in his mother's eyes. His brother's approval, and regretfully admitted by Ezri herself, her sister's indifference from being absent in a time where Norvo needed her the most. For those of us out there who are struggling with trying to discover our fullest potential, in whatever form you believe that to be, then Norvo is a cautionary tale about having his truth supplanted by what ultimately destroyed him in the end, and forced him to fall down a path that not only erased the sensitive, beautiful, and inspiring soul of someone who had have inspired so many others, but became yet another statistic and a tool for what we see tragically happen every day in our life: the loss of individuality.
Mission Log is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Executive producer, Rod Roddenberry. Our website, your opportunity to comment and connect with us, is missionlogpodcast.com. If you'd like to support Mission Log directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog. And for more Star Trek news and discussion, be sure to visit trekmovie.com.
On the next Mission Log, the Emperor's New Cloak.
Some of the music for Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com. Special thanks to consulting producers Adam Brusky, Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, John Mann, Mike Richards, and Mike Schabel. Considering what happened with Bilby's wife, it's probably for the best that Bilby's cat now spends his time leaving cat hair all over the chief's pants. End transmission.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.